Underwater archaeology in Turkey began in 1958 and 1959, when New York photojournalist Peter Throckmorton lived on this Turkish sponge boat, Mount Da Vinci, asking its captain, Kemal Aras, to show him any ancient shipwrecks he had seen on the seabed. One of more than a dozen Kemal told him about lay almost 100 feet deep near Cape Caledonia, on the western side of the Bay of Antalya on Turkey's southern coast. Peter went there in 1959 and saw the wreck lying between 2 of 5 islands just off the end of the cape. He recognized that it was over 3,000 years old, the oldest shipwreck ever found, dating from the Bronze Age. He convinced the University of Pennsylvania Museum to sponsor an expedition to see if it was possible to excavate an ancient wreck underwater as carefully as ancient tombs and buildings are excavated on land. So, in 1960, after establishing a camp on a narrow strip of beach where we found fresh water and would live for the next 3 months, graduate archaeology student George Bass, Peter Throckmorton and myself began the excavation of the wreck with an international team from the United States, France, Turkey, England, and Germany. Anne Bass arrived, surprised to see where she would spend her honeymoon with George. Each day we sailed out an hour from camp to where the ship sank, 8 of us diving from an old sponge dragger moored over the site. Mapping the site was as important as mapping any archaeological site on land, for this was the first ancient shipwreck ever excavated in its entirety on the seabed. Sometimes we removed sediment with a large suction hose known as an airlift, and sometimes we chiseled free from the seabed large masses of metal cargo, concreted together, which we raised to the surface with air-filled lifting bags. Our methods may have been crude, but our results were of great historical importance. The ton of cargo we found wasn't attractive, a lot of scrap bronze, mostly broken agricultural tools from the island of Cyprus, and ingots of copper and tin. But the wreck rewrote the history of Bronze Age trade, for it showed Phoenicians sailing these waters centuries earlier than historians had believed. Now, Captain Kemal, assisted by his fellow divers, prepares to dive 120 feet deep off Yarsiada, or Flat Island, on the southwest Turkish coast. The treacherous reef running out from the island has sunk a dozen ships over the centuries, the last being a modern freighter that ran aground there in 1993. But it is sponges Kemal is after. His livelihood depends on them. The aged compressor sends air down through the hose, paid out a fathom at a time by his tender. Lowered gently from above, Captain Kemal soon reaches the seabed, where he begins his quest for sponges. As he searches the rocky bottom, he is almost neutrally buoyant, so his lead shoes do not crush the cargo of 1,300-year-old jars across which he strolls. He has no interest in Byzantine amphores. He knows that they are old, but illegally selling for no more than $5 a piece in Turkey, they are not worth the hassle to be encountered from local customs, police, or the Coast Guard. His sponge bag is full. He signals that he is going to surface. Assisted by his diving companions, Kemal surfaces at Mount Da Vinci's diving ladder, climbs aboard, and hands his bag of sponges to waiting crew. Picking sponges is only the first step. As some of his crew remove Kemal's helmet, others on board begin to prepare the sponges for market, either threading them so they can be hung out to dry, or crushing them between their feet in order to remove the living black membranes that cover them. Diving now over, Mount Da Vinci begins the 2-hour sail back to its home port of Bodrum. Today, tourists arrive in jumbo jets at the modern international airport outside Bodrum, and the population swells to 250,000 in summer. There are traffic jams, and at night, the noise of 1,000 bars and the world's second largest discotheque. But back in 1961, Bodrum was an isolated, sleepy town of 5,000 people. Its only automobile, an old Jeep taxi. A diesel generator supplied electricity for 2 hours a day, and drinking water came from a distant spring. In 1961, George Bass, Ann Bass and I, veterans of the Cape Caledonia excavation, were back in Turkey with Turkish photographer Mustafa Kapkan, there to excavate the Byzantine ship Kemal found at Yasiada. Mustafa had shown us the wreck at the end of the 1960 Cape Caledonia excavation, and except for Peter, now working in Greece, we are all back in Bodrum. Herb Greer is once again an expedition photographer, but physician Charles Fries is a newcomer. Along with Kemal and his mate of many years, we are soon joined by the rest of the team, including Swarthmore undergraduate Susan Woomer and diving instructor Larry Jolene. Like this lady on what is today a 4-lane highway, we are in town for market day. The Bodrum economy was modest, based on agriculture. There are no supermarkets in those days, but plenty of fresh produce. Anne and a young assistant to Dursun make their way through the crowd looking for tomatoes or fresh cucumbers at just pennies a kilo. Anne has been up since 4:30 to buy fresh bread for a 5:30 breakfast. But food was not the only thing found in the market. Joined by our cook, Anne continues shopping. On their way home, they pass marble reminders that Bodrum was once the ancient city of Halikarnassos, birthplace of Herodotus, the father of history. With another veteran of the Cape Caledonia excavation, art professor Eric Ryan, we stop with the luxury of a shave on what was, and still is, the main tourist street of Bodrum. We run into an old sponge diver and head off to learn about more wrecks. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. Every Friday, the team heads for the hammam, the Turkish bath, to rid themselves of salt, grime, and exhaust fumes. Herb Greer shampoos, while architect Bill Wiener enjoys working up a good lather in the heated steam room. The Bodrum harbor now contains an enormous marina, a transient home for magnificent yachts from around the world. In 1961, there were no tourist boats, only boats for fishing and sponging. We depart at 6 for a 2-hour sail aboard Sarane, a fast, sloop-rigged motor sailor. Today the sea is calm. On most days, we sail head-on into gale-force wind of the seasonal Meltem, which keeps even large steel freighters in port. Once out of the harbor, with the sail hoisted, we head up the coast. The team, with few hours sleep, grabs this opportunity to rest, relax, and perhaps catch up on some reading. Fred Van Doornik discusses the wreck plans with George. 45 years later, the three of us are still working together. After 2 hours, we approach the diving barge, anchored 4 points over the wreck. German diver Valdemar Ealing, another veteran of Cape Caledonia, has spent the night guarding the barge with Boston University undergraduate David Owen, old Hasip Amja, and another member of a Turkish crew. As we transfer necessities onto the barge, French mechanic Jean Naz cranks the tank compressors into action, starts the airlift compressor, and stacks air-filled tanks ready for use by the morning's dives. George discusses photographs and underwater drawings made the day before, especially with architect Bill Wiener, who is responsible for the final site plan. but everyone on the team is involved in discussions of how to improve our efficiency. It's then time for the morning's first dive. Earaches are a daily problem for Dr. Fries. I discuss with my partner the task before us. Our time on the wreck is limited to less than 1 hour a day in 2 dives. We all rehearse in our minds exactly what we plan to do on each dive. The dive is carefully timed from the surface, where photographs remain to be studied, cameras loaded, and underwater drawings completed. Below, the cargo of Byzantine amphoras remains untouched. Larry Jolene first suggested that we build plane tables like those used by surveyors on land to plot the positions of amphoras and other objects on the wreck. I sight through my alidade onto an upright range pole held over an amphora by Fred, while Eric is sighting on the pole from the opposite side of the wreck. Eric and I trace vectors along the base of our alidades onto sheets of frosted plastic paper and number each in turn, while Fred keeps a record of the amphoras identified by labels attached to them on which he holds the range pole. Then Fred is waved on to another amphora. Plane tables located amphoras from one end of a wreck to the other, but for drawing individual groups of amphoras, we used wire grids of 1, 2, and 3 meters on a side. Susan was especially adept at hovering over each wire square and sketching what lay below her. Once their position was plotted, the amphoras were freed from seabed concretion and carried off the site to be sent to the surface. In 1961, we often filled the amphoras with air and sent them like balloons up to the surface for retrieval. But we soon discontinued the practice because amphoras with hairline cracks sometimes exploded from the air expanding in them. We also were losing sediment, which we later learned contained traces such as seeds of the amphora's original contents. U.S. Navy diving personnel who saw these scenes were horrified that we so casually removed our regulator mouthpieces 120 feet deep. Nevertheless, this brutal method did work for the majority of the amphoras sent up in this manner. The amphoras were immediately covered with wet cloths to prevent their cracking under the hot sun. From morning till evening, work on the seabed continued uninterrupted with military precision. As soon as one team had completed its dive and was decompressing, the next team was in the water on its way to the bottom. Another experimental method of mapping the site was by means of a mapping frame designed for us by Frédéric Dumas, for many years Commandant Cousteau's right hand. By moving a calibrated horizontal beam along the level and also calibrated sides of a frame, as if on tracks, and then sliding a calibrated vertical pole along the beam and dropping it onto any artifact within the frame, which was 5 meters on the side, a diver could record the exact position in 3 dimensions of that artifact. Because this prototype frame required the use of 2 divers to move the heavy beam along, it did not save us much time, but it remains theoretically a sound idea. In order that diving never stopped during the day, we ate in shifts. When we had completed our morning dives, we grabbed a plate and found an open space on deck. One kind soul thought of cold and hungry divers decompressing at the end of their dive and passed down a bunch of grapes. The next team, however, is already dressed and prepared for the next dive of the day. 2 of the team used the airlift. In these early days, we still used a heavy metal pipe for our underwater vacuum cleaner, whereas today we use lightweight plastic irrigation pipes. On top of the airlift pipe, 65 feet above the wreck, we mounted a wire screen box that allowed most of the sediment sucked up by the airlift to be carried away by the current. Grains of sand too large to go through the wire mesh, along with bits of broken pottery, were funneled down into a canvas bag, which we hauled up to the barge twice a day to search through its contents. This was an added precaution to our careful excavating, but we seldom found artifacts in the bag. A rare exception was a gold coin, one of 16 found. These, but more especially 54 copper coins, date the wreck to almost precisely AD 626, thereby dating everything in the wreck. Objects uncovered by the airlift were again raised to the surface by means of air, but more safely than the amphores filled with air. Here a diver fills an airbag attached to a wire lifting basket, which can rest on the seabed until filled. In this case, whole and partial amphoras and whole and partial roof tiles from the ship's galley roof fill the basket. Some of our lift bags could raise many hundreds of pounds. As this basket rises towards the surface, it passes decompressing divers who are unable to lend a hand. Other divers must jump in and swim out from the barge to retrieve the basket, tow it over to the diving ladder, and pass the artifacts up from the basket to waiting hands on deck. Larry and I enjoy a joke after a job well done. It's important to know where each of the objects was found on the wreck, so we study again the site plans. From the plans, Fred will determine the height and size of a tiled galley roof, and David and Susan will get an idea of a tiled firebox covered by an iron grill for cooking in the galley. The counterweight for the ship's steelyard for weighing cargo was a lead-filled bust of a pagan goddess, Athena. The steelyard itself, the largest known from antiquity, is studied for its calibration. The timekeeper notes the last dive has finished decompressing. It is time to return to boatroom. Larry Jolene, impatient to get home, does not wait for the dinghy, but dives in and swims back to the waiting Sanane. As old Uncle Hassip raises Sanane's anchor, those who are boatroom bound wave goodbye to their companions, whose turn it is to sleep on the barge to protect its equipment through the night. In a little more than an hour, the boatroom castle appears. Back in town, there is no time to rest. Early wetsuits of unlined neoprene required nearly daily mending, and the old two hose regulators needed to be carefully washed and rinsed between dives. Bill Wiener, using notes and drawings brought from the barge by David Owen, continues making a highly accurate site plan. They work at a drafting table made of boards laid across empty 55-gallon oil drums in an old house we rented at that time for $15 a month. Now owned and renovated by a recording mogul, the founder of Atlantic Records, the house sees guests ranging from princes of a crown to princes of showbiz and is worth several millions. The 15th century castle of the Knights of St. John of Malta was built largely of blocks quarried from ancient Halicarnassus, including the tomb of King Mausoleus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Classical column drums were used as building blocks and carved with coats of arms, as here, St. George slaying the dragon. This is how began the Bodrum Museum of Underwater Archaeology, now the most visited archaeological museum in Turkey. In 1961, the castle was just a forgotten ruin guarded by Old Mehmet. Discoveries made in 1961 included the second oldest known wine thief and the chains of a large steelyard once used for weighing cargo. George had excavated the best dated collection of 7th century Byzantine pottery in the world, including cooking pots, plates, pitchers, and cups. Metal finds included a bronze censer, perhaps for incense after meals, the bust of Athena, and the steelyard itself, which we have seen before. There was not yet a museum in the Bodrum Castle, but we had permission from the Turkish Ministry of Education to lay a stone floor in the Knights' dining hall, fix metal bars on the windows, and add solid wooden doors to the hall to use as a depot. A year later, we added a few glass cases. Inside the dining hall, Anne continued cataloguing ingots and other finds from the Cape Caledonia shipwreck, while Susan drew not only finds from the Byzantine wreck, but various types of pottery we collected from sponge divers. Thus began Peter Throckmorton's dream, a real museum. Once more assisted by young Dursun, Anne and Susan end their day's work and descend to the ruined castle, scarcely recognizable today. At the end they pass through this long, empty courtyard that is now a lush and popular tea garden shaded by immense trees. On our return to Turkey, in 1962 we decided the daily 4-hour commute was too tiring, that it ate too much into our productive time. So, even though there is no water on Yarsiada, we built a camp of tents and buildings of stone, wooden uprights, and mosquito netting with roofs of woven mats. Susan Woomer, the only single woman in 1962, had a tent to herself, as did George and Anne. But we men shared the dormitory. Sleeping soundly, sometimes not even the breakfast bell woke us, which led to a shout from George. With limited water, the morning shower was only a damp rag over your face. We later built a shade of woven palms to eat under, but in our earliest days in camp, we baked our brains under the sun all through breakfast. Living on the island allowed us to do so much more of our cataloging, object photography, and drawing at the site. From the year before, 1961, we had the most accurate site plan ever made of an ancient shipwreck. In the upper level were globular cargo amphors, and below that were roof tiles and small finds from the ship's galley. In the third level, we had the first traces of a wooden hull. To map the wooden remains of a ship's hull more efficiently, George designed a step framework of angle iron to support two movable photographic towers. Eric Ryan's diagrams show how we plan to assemble it, overwreck, and use it. Our daily commute to the diving barge is no longer 2 hours each way, but only a few minutes row. After breakfast, we pile into our dinghy for a quick trip. Once we reach the barge, the divers immediately begin their assigned tasks. Another change in 1962 was to hookah diving gear. The amount of air from the surface through a hose was unlimited, so we never ran out of air, as we sometimes did with tanks. Once on the seabed, diving archaeologists begin the assembly of the step frames, first driving in the pipe legs, then putting the angle iron frames on them, and lastly leveling the steps in place and tightening thumb screws to hold them tightly to their legs. To avoid damaging the fragile wood, we always removed our fins. Then we picked up stemmed identification labels and moved barefoot over the step frames above the wood. To prevent the bits of wood from floating away, we used hundreds of sharpened bicycle spokes to pin the hull remains to the seabed, like so many insects on a board. Much of the hull has now been uncovered and pinned down. We move up the slope over labeled planks and frames or ribs. The ship's keel is badly riddled with teredos or shipworms, and the bow of the hull, held out of protective sediment by a rock outcrop, has been completely devoured. The ship carried 11 iron anchors at its bow. 7 stacked on deck, are now concreted together into a solid mass. A pair of bow anchors on either side of the hull remain in place. One of more than a dozen terracotta oil lamps that once lit the ship comes to light during the hull study. The lamps are of types common in Constantinople and the Black Sea area at the time. It's time for this dive to end. As chief diver, I give a signal for the divers to ascend. The sound carries clearly to the bottom, 120 feet below, and the divers begin their ascent as their tenders on the barge above reel in their air hoses. So that no time is lost between dives, those who have just reached the decompression stop remove their hooker harnesses and send them up to waiting divers on the barge, while they switch to a short air hose to complete their decompression. I check the diving roster to see who should be getting their equipment ready. The decompressing divers, however, have news of the wreck that they want to pass up to the next team. They ring the bell, which alerts those of us on the barge that the written message is all ready to be retrieved. It's my job to haul in the clipboard, read what is written, and transmit the news to David Owen, who can now dive. In this way, not a moment is lost between its successive dives. Diving is as precise as clockwork from breakfast till sundown. As decompressing divers pass the minutes by playing tic-tac-toe, David's team passes them on their way down. Their job is to map the hull remains from the photo towers that are slid over the step frame placed on the wreck. Once the tower is positioned, one of the team swims to its top, places the rolling marine camera into place, and photographs down through the tower's wire-gridded base. Elevation measurements are taken with plumb lines lowered from the tower bases, and even angles of pieces of wood are measured by means of a protractor and a vertical string buoyed by light bulb. As the summer draws to a close, it is time for all of the students to return to their universities. We swim up the airlift pipe for the last time and give the basket the last shake before closing camp and taking everything back to Bodrum for the winter. We decompress at the end of our last working dive, playing our last game of tic-tac-toe as the barge above continues to pitch gently in the swell. Like the stevedores who loaded the amphoras onto the Byzantine ship more than a millennium earlier, we now carry them from Yasiada and load them on Sanane for their trip to Bodrum. Captain Kemal carries amphoras across the courtyard that is today a popular cafe with hundreds of visitors, and, with others, enters the castle, passes through what is now a tree-shaded tea garden, and climbs higher through the ruins that are now restored, making this a museum visited by more than 250,000 people a year. In 1963 and 1964, we would return with the first methods of mapping the seabed with stereo photographs and the first commercially launched research submersible in America. Whereas in 1962, we knew only that we had completed another summer in safety and celebrated it with our only night dive, 120 feet deep, swimming over the Byzantine cargo.